I never meant to read this diary. I keep telling myself this over and over, because sometimes it seems like that very moment destroyed my life. Though if I'm honest, I now understand that my life was already ruined long before that day. I just lived inside an illusion and didn't know it. It all began when I was holding an old notebook belonging to his mother, the one they found among her things after the funeral. I was told that if I wanted, I could take something to remember her by, because she had always treated me with a strange warmth that sometimes even embarrassed me. She would call just to ask how I was feeling, would worry about my problems more than about her own son's. At the time, I didn't think much of it. It seemed she simply saw in me the daughter she never had. I took the notebook almost automatically because it was lying on top, and no one was particularly interested in its contents. I sat with it in my hands for a long time without opening it, because I understood these were someone else's thoughts, written for herself. But then I finally opened it, and at that moment I couldn't even begin to imagine that in a few hours my reality would start to crumble. At first there were ordinary entries, the kind of things people write when they need somewhere to put their thoughts. She wrote about her health, about her fear of aging, about memories of my husband's childhood. Sometimes she wrote about how she worried for him, because she considered him someone who too easily succumbed to weakness. At the time, this looked like ordinary maternal strictness, nothing special. I read slowly, sometimes closing the notebook, sometimes going back several pages. I even felt I was doing something not quite right, reading the personal notes of someone who could no longer object. At one point, I even thought I should stop. But then I came across an entry that made me stop and reread it several times, because at first my brain simply refused to accept what I saw. In that entry, she recalled a conversation with her son after his trip to Miami several years ago. That same trip I knew about. He had told me then that it was a short business trip, nothing special, just a few days. I even remember feeling a little envious because he had flown off to the warmth while I stayed home, worked, and waited for his return. But in the diary, that trip looked completely different. She wrote that this was where everything began. She wrote that he had told her about it himself, as if he needed to confess to someone, but didn't have the courage to tell me the truth. I reread that passage again and again because there was a name there, Clara. And at first, I decided that perhaps it was just some random acquaintance or a brief story that had long since ended. But then she described details, and it was the details that began to destroy my peace. She wrote that he had told her how he met this woman. According to him, it began quite by accident. Her car had broken down on the road not far from Miami. He stopped because she was standing next to the car trying to call someone, but the reception was poor. He approached to ask if everything was all right. She explained that she was driving to a small art center on the coast where she was supposed to meet a friend, but the car had simply stopped and wouldn't start again. He offered to give her a ride because it was about half an hour's drive to that center. The diary said he described this situation to his mother almost like an ordinary story, like a chance encounter on the road that could have ended with simple thanks and been forgotten the next day. He drove her to where she needed to go, dropped her at the entrance to that center where some exhibition was taking place, and even then they exchanged numbers. She wrote that when he told her about this, he said at first it was simply out of politeness, but the next day he wrote to her again. He offered to help with the car because it was still on the road. He told his mother he felt responsible because he was the one who had left her there. The diary said that he himself drove her back to the car, then called a tow truck, then went with her to the service station. And it was there that he did what his mother called the beginning of a problem that could no longer be stopped. He paid for her car repair. He explained this by saying she was in a strange city and had financial difficulties. He told his mother it was simply a gesture of help, nothing more. I sat with this diary and felt a strange tension growing inside me, because I knew about that trip. I remembered those days. I remembered how he called me from Miami saying he was tired after work. I remembered how he said he hardly left the hotel. I remembered how he said he spent time in meetings. And now I was reading about how at that very same moment, he was meeting a woman on the road, driving her to an art center, returning to her the next day, going with her to the auto shop, and paying for her car repair. But I was still trying to explain this to myself logically. People sometimes dramatize things in their diaries. Elderly people can misunderstand situations. Maybe it was a brief mistake that had long since ended. Maybe she simply attached too much importance to an ordinary story. I clung to these thoughts desperately, as if they could return my reality to what it was. But then I continued reading, and that's when everything got worse. Because further on, she wrote that this story didn't end after that trip. She wrote that he returned to this woman again and again. She wrote that she had known about this for several years, that he sometimes flew to see her under the pretext of work, that he promised to stop, but each time found an excuse. She wrote that she saw how he lived a double life, and that each time he sat next to me at the same table, it became hard for her to look at me. I remember how at that moment my body seemed to stop responding normally. I read the words, but emptiness appeared between them, as if my brain was trying to protect itself and wouldn't let me fully grasp their meaning. The name Clara, Miami, the broken car, the repair he paid for, several years. And all this time I lived next to a man who looked me in the eyes every day and spoke to me as if there were no secrets between us. But the strangest part came later. She wrote about the inheritance. She wrote that she had decided to leave most of her money to me, not her son, me. And she explained this not as resentment or punishment, but as guilt. She wrote that she knew the truth would come out one day. She wrote that if this happened after her death, she wanted me to have the opportunity to leave and start a new life, rather than staying with a man who had lived a double life for years. I remember the moment when I finished reading that entry. I sat with that diary and felt a thought forming inside me that I wanted to run away from. Because if what his mother wrote was true, then the man I had lived with for so many years had started cheating on me because of a chance encounter on the road with a woman named Clara, whose car had simply broken down. And the worst part was that at that moment, I still didn't know if it was true. But after what I read, my life could no longer return to the state it had been in before. I could have stopped and not read further. Several times I closed the diary and held my palm on the cover, as if trying to physically hold everything inside those pages so nothing would escape. Because as long as information remains unread, you can still make up excuses in your head. You can tell yourself it's a misunderstanding, that an elderly person might have misunderstood something, that the story ended long ago. But once you've read half the truth, it's impossible to stop. The remaining half begins to press even harder. So I opened the diary again. The later entries became heavier. You could see it even in the handwriting. The lines became uneven, words sometimes overlapping each other, as if she wrote quickly and held back emotions. And it was there that it became clear that the story with Clara was not simply disappointment in her son for her. It was a personal pain that took her back to the past. She wrote that she tried to talk to him, at first calmly. She wrote that she wanted to convince him to stop while it could still be fixed. She reminded him that he had a wife, a family, a life he had built for many years. But each such conversation ended the same way. He became irritated. He said she was interfering in his personal life. He said everything was under control and that she was making a tragedy out of the situation. There was a long entry in the diary about the day they had a real fight. She wrote that then, for the first time, she told him directly that he was becoming like his father. And it was after these words that the conversation stopped being a conversation. His father had cheated on her for years. She wrote about this briefly, but in these lines there was more pain than in dozens of pages before. She wrote that she had tried for a long time to keep the family together, closed her eyes to many things, convinced herself that everything could be survived. But one day her husband simply left for another woman, without explanations, without attempts to fix anything. He simply chose another life. She wrote that after this she tried for a long time to piece herself together. She learned to live on, but the pain never went away. It simply became part of her. And when her son confessed that he had another woman, she felt not only anger, she felt a strange sense of repetition, as if the story was beginning again, only now that woman was me. She wrote that she told him this directly, that if he continued living a double life, he would destroy not only his marriage, but also the person who suspected nothing. He answered her that she was dramatizing. He said these were just relationships that didn't mean much. He said everything was under control and no one would ever know. She wrote one short phrase after this conversation. People who live double lives are always confident that everything is under control, until the truth comes out. When I finished reading this entry, I closed the diary. It was physically hard to continue. I sat and stared at one point, because pieces of reality were beginning to come together in my head. Pieces that had previously seemed like ordinary details of life, his trips, his delays at work, his fatigue after business trips. All of this suddenly stopped being ordinary. But I still had one thought to cling to. Maybe this all ended long ago. Maybe this story remained in the past. That same day, the ceremony for the reading of his mother's will was supposed to take place. We knew about this in advance. It was a formal procedure to which close relatives were invited. I went there in a strange state. On the outside, everything looked normal, but inside me something was already happening that I couldn't stop. My husband looked calm, even confident, like a person who had come to an ordinary legal procedure and simply wanted to get it over with quickly. He sat next to me and sometimes leaned in to quietly comment on something regarding the formalities. His voice was familiar, ordinary, that same voice I had heard every day for many years. And this was the strangest part, because in my head, the name Clara was already echoing. When the lawyer began reading the will, at first everything proceeded according to standard. Legal formulations, listing of property, dry words that usually don't evoke strong emotions. But then I noticed how my husband straightened up slightly. This happened at the moment when they began listing who the property would go to. First, small sums went to charitable funds, then several items to distant relatives. I saw a slight bewilderment appear on his face. He was clearly expecting a different sequence. He was waiting for his name to be called. But his name wasn't called. The lawyer continued reading, and the further he read, the tenser the atmosphere became, because at some point it became obvious that the main part of the inheritance was being distributed without her son's participation. I felt my husband's breathing change next to me. It was almost unnoticeable, but I knew him well enough to understand that panic was beginning inside him. He no longer looked confident. He looked like a person who suddenly realizes that something is not going according to the scenario he expected. And then my name was called. The main part of the inheritance was passing to me. The room became very quiet. I felt his gaze on me. This wasn't just a look of surprise. There was confusion, anger, and something like shock in it, as if he was trying to quickly understand what was happening and why everything was going this way. He barely moved, but I saw how his jaw tensed. The lawyer continued reading the text of the will, calmly and without emotion, as if speaking of the most ordinary things. But for my husband, this was not an ordinary thing, because by the end of the reading, it became absolutely clear. He received almost nothing, and at that moment, I felt a cold understanding inside, because I already knew the reason. I knew it thanks to the diary lying at my home. I knew that his mother had done this not by chance. She did it because she knew about Clara. And while the lawyer was finishing the last lines of the will, my husband still didn't know that I knew too. After the ceremony of reading the will, my life seemed to transition into a state of constant inner tension. On the outside, everything looked almost normal. We returned home, talked about everyday things, did what people who have lived together for a long time do. But inside me, there was no longer that reality in which I had lived before. The pages of the diary, the name Clara, the story of the broken car, his mother's conversations, her guilt, they constantly spun in my head. I looked at him and understood that now, every gesture, every calm word sounded different. Everything looked like part of some complex construction that I simply hadn't noticed before. I tried to observe him, look for some confirmation or refutation of what I had read. But the scariest part was that externally, he had hardly changed. He behaved like a person distressed about the inheritance. He was irritable, sometimes flared up, sometimes became cold and distant. But he didn't look guilty. He looked offended. And this was a strange feeling, because I sat next to a man who had possibly lived a double life for years. But at that moment, he looked as if he was the one who had been betrayed. For several days, I tried to convince myself that I needed to verify everything, that I couldn't make decisions based on a diary. But the longer I lived next to him after that reading, the stronger the feeling grew inside me that the truth was already somewhere nearby. I just couldn't see it fully yet. And at some point, I realized that I could no longer pretend that nothing was happening. I asked him to talk. I didn't start the conversation with accusations. I said I felt that something had changed between us. I said that after his mother's death, many things looked different. I said I needed to honestly understand where we stood. And then I said I wanted a divorce. I expected many reactions. I expected anger. I expected attempts to justify himself. I expected him to start denying, or conversely, to confess. But his reaction was completely different. At first, he simply looked at me as if he didn't understand what I was talking about. Then his face became cold, not angry, precisely cold. He asked why I had suddenly decided to destroy the marriage. I said I no longer felt trust. He asked if I had reasons for such words. I said there were things that made me look at our life differently. He looked at me attentively and said I was making a big mistake. I didn't yet understand then that this conversation would become the beginning of something much worse. Because a few weeks later, when the legal process began, I saw a side of this man that I had never known before. He didn't simply agree to the divorce. He began to defend himself. And his defense looked as if I had become the main enemy in his life. In court, his position was very clear and very harsh. His lawyer constructed a story that sounded convincing to people who didn't know our life. According to this version, everything happened quite differently. According to their words, even before his mother's death, I had begun to actively influence her. They claimed that I gradually convinced her to change the will and leave the main part of the property to me. They said that an elderly person is easily susceptible to pressure from close people. They hinted that I used her trust and emotional state. And then, when everything was already legally formalized, decided to leave the marriage. When I first heard this version in court, everything inside me went cold. Because this wasn't just an accusation, it was an attempt to completely reverse reality. In this version of the story, he looked like a person who had been deceived. First by his own mother, who turned out to be under influence, then by his wife, who decided to take advantage of the situation. I tried to explain to the court that I had a reason why his mother made such a decision. I brought the diary. I told them about the entries. I told them about Clara, about Miami, about how his mother knew about his relationship with another woman. But the diary turned out to be insufficient. The court didn't accept it as full evidence. I was explained that these were personal notes that could reflect a person's subjective emotions, that they didn't legally confirm facts. I sat and listened to this, feeling a sense of complete helplessness rising inside me. Because the truth existed, I held it in my hands. But legally, it was as if it didn't exist. My husband looked confident. He sat calmly, sometimes writing something down, sometimes quietly discussing something with his lawyer. He looked like a person in control of the situation. And at some point, I realized that if everything remained as it was, this story would end with me becoming the person who destroyed someone else's family for the sake of inheritance. After one of the hearings, I returned home and took out the diary again. I began rereading the entries more carefully, page by page, word by word. And that's when I understood one thing. In the diary, there was a name, Clara, and there were details. Miami, the art center, the broken car, the repair he paid for. These weren't simply an elderly woman's emotions. These were concrete facts. And then for the first time, a thought occurred to me that at first seemed almost insane. If the court lacked evidence, then I needed to find the person who was the evidence. I sat with this thought for a long time, because I understood that this was a step after which there would be no way back. But the more I thought, the clearer it became that there was no other way out. If Clara existed, if their relationship continued all these years, then somewhere there was a woman who knew the truth about my marriage more than I did myself. And then I made a decision that completely changed the course of this story. I decided to find Clara and try to convince her to come to court and tell what she knew. The decision to find Clara at first seemed almost absurd. For several days I tried to convince myself that it was too radical, that there were other ways to defend myself in court, that perhaps I could still find some documents, some indirect confirmations. But the longer I thought, the clearer it became that no indirect evidence could replace a person who knew the truth. The diary had proven insufficient. My words also meant nothing. The entire legal picture was constructed as if I had simply decided to destroy the marriage after receiving the money. And each new day in this situation made me weaker. I began to feel how I was gradually turning into the person I was being accused of being, though I was the one who had been betrayed. At some point, a feeling appeared inside me that if I stopped now and simply defended myself, I would lose not only the case, I would lose my own sense of reality. So I bought a ticket. I didn't tell anyone about my plans. Even to my own lawyer, I only said that I would be away for a few days and would try to gather additional information. Inside, there was a strange combination of fear and cold determination. I understood that I was flying to another city to find a woman about whom I knew only a name and a few random details from a diary. This looked almost insane, but at the same time, I felt that it was in this direction that the truth lay, which had been eluding me all this time. I arrived in Miami on Friday evening. I only had the weekend, because at the beginning of the next week, a new court hearing was scheduled. I immediately understood that there was almost no time, and if I wanted to find something, I would have to act quickly. The diary mentioned the art center where he had once driven her on the day her car broke down. This was the first thread. I started with this. The next day, I literally walked around the city with one single goal. I went into art centers, small galleries, workshops where artists displayed their work. I asked about a painter named Clara. At first, people simply shrugged. It turned out to be a common name, and no one immediately understood who exactly I was talking about. Several times it seemed to me that I was simply wasting time, and that this whole idea had been a mistake. But I continued. I went from one place to another, first art centers, then small studios, then even several auto repair shops, because the diary had the story about how my husband paid for her car repair. I didn't know if there was any point in this search, but each new conversation gave at least a small probability. By Saturday evening, I was almost certain I wouldn't find her, but that's when one of the employees of a small gallery said she knew a painter named Clara who sometimes exhibited her work in various places and lived not far from the city. She didn't know her personally, but remembered seeing her work at a small exhibition several months ago. I asked for everything she could remember, a name, an approximate area, the type of work. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start looking further. By Sunday morning, I already knew where a woman named Clara lived, who actually painted and occasionally exhibited in small galleries. When I stood near her house for the first time, I had real doubt, because until that moment, everything had been like a task: find a name, find an address. But now before me was a real door, behind which was a person who could confirm or destroy everything I considered true. I stood in front of that door for a long time, then finally knocked. When she opened it, I immediately knew it was her, not because I knew what she looked like, but because at that moment, a strange feeling of recognition arose inside me, which is hard to explain. She looked at me calmly, but somewhat warily, like a person who hadn't expected guests. I said I had seen her work at an exhibition and would like to discuss the possibility of purchasing one of the paintings. I explained that it was important for me to clarify a few details in person. This was plausible enough for her to agree to talk. We went inside. For several minutes, I actually asked questions about her work, because I needed time to gather my thoughts. But inside, I already understood that I couldn't delay for long. And at some point, I simply said her name, Clara, then named my husband's name. I saw how her face changed almost instantly, not sharply, but enough to make it clear that she knew who I was talking about. After that, I told her everything. I told her about his mother's diary, about the entry about Miami, about the broken car, about how he paid for the repair, about the years during which their relationship continued, about the court, about the accusations that I had manipulated his mother for the inheritance. I spoke for a long time, almost without pauses, because I felt that if I stopped, I might lose my resolve. She listened very attentively, sometimes lowering her eyes, sometimes looking at me as if trying to understand why I had come at all. When I finished, she was silent for a long time, then said she didn't want to participate in other people's legal conflicts. She said her relationship with my husband had never been part of some war. She said she didn't want to become the cause of an even bigger scandal. I expected such an answer, but I told her what had long become my main argument. I said that right now, the whole story looked as if I had destroyed the marriage for the sake of money. I said that if the truth didn't come out, that's exactly how it would remain. And I said one more thing that seemed to make her think. I said that if she confirmed the truth, my husband would no longer be bound by marriage. He would become officially free. After that, there was another pause. She didn't look happy about this thought. Rather the opposite, but something resembling a decision appeared in her face, which a person makes reluctantly. Finally, she said she would think about it, then asked when the next court hearing would be. I named the date. She looked at me for a long time, as if assessing how far everything had gone, and then quietly said she would come. Not because she wanted to participate in the conflict, but because sometimes the truth must be spoken aloud, even if it brings relief to no one. I wasn't sure she would actually come. On the day of the next court hearing, I sat in the courtroom and felt the same tension that had accompanied me for the past weeks. Everything was already proceeding according to a familiar scenario. My husband's lawyer spoke confidently and calmly, again repeating the same story they had constructed around me. In this version of events, everything looked very logical. According to their words, even before his mother's death, I had gradually begun to influence her, convinced her to change the will, achieved that the main part of the property would pass to me, and then decided to destroy the marriage when I got everything I wanted. This version sounded clear, structured, and almost convincing. I had heard it several times already, but each time it evoked the same feeling in me, as if someone was slowly rewriting my life, turning me into a person I had never been. When the lawyer finished, the judge asked if my side had any additional evidence or witnesses. At this moment, a brief thought appeared inside me that perhaps it would end just like this, that Clara wouldn't come, that she had changed her mind, that she had decided not to interfere in someone else's conflict. And I couldn't even blame her for that. But exactly at that moment, the door opened in the courtroom. At first, I didn't turn around. I simply felt how the attention of the people in the room changed. When I finally turned my head, I saw her. Clara stood at the entrance and looked calm, though her face showed that this decision had not come easily to her. She approached the table, introduced herself, and said she was ready to testify. What followed happened almost without emotion. She spoke calmly, almost detachedly, as if talking about events that had long become part of the past. She told how she met my husband in Miami. She explained that her car had broken down on the road. He stopped and offered help. He drove her to the art center where she needed to go. Then the next day he helped with the car, drove her to the service station, and paid for the repair. She said that after this they continued communicating. At first these were conversations, then meetings, and over time their connection became something that couldn't be called a chance acquaintance. She said these relationships didn't last several weeks or several months, they lasted for years. She didn't try to defend herself. She didn't blame him. She didn't try to soften what was happening. She simply told the facts she knew. I didn't look at my husband while she spoke, but I heard how a particular silence fell in the room, the kind that appears when people realize they have just heard something that completely changes the picture. After her testimony, the process began to move completely differently. The story about how I manipulated his mother for the inheritance no longer looked so convincing. The diary, which had previously been considered simply personal notes, suddenly began to be perceived as the testimony of a woman who knew the truth and tried to explain her decisions. In the end, the court granted the divorce and rejected the attempt to challenge the will. Legally, everything ended fairly quickly after this. When the hearing concluded and people began to disperse, for the first time in a long while, I felt silence in my head. Not relief and not joy. Rather, the feeling that a long and heavy story had finally stopped. I left the court a free woman. My former husband also became a free man. And somewhere in this story was a woman named Clara, who once stood by the road next to a broken car and couldn't imagine that a stranger's chance help would one day lead all of us into a courtroom. Sometimes I think about his mother, about how she knew the truth long before me, and about how she left me not only an inheritance, but the opportunity to leave. But there is one thought that still doesn't give me peace. If I hadn't opened that diary then, if I had simply closed it and put it back on the shelf, perhaps I would still be living next to a man who would look me in the eyes and say everything was fine. And I still don't know which is worse, to live inside a beautiful lie, or to one day learn the truth and destroy everything that seemed like real life.